In the mountains of Afghanistan, where silence can mean the difference between life and death, Marine Sergeant Sarah Martinez had never imagined she would become the most unlikely sniper in military history. She was a communications specialist, trained to handle radios and satellite equipment, not rifles that could take a life from over a mile away. But on a scorching Tuesday morning in 2018, when her unit found themselves pinned down by enemy fire and their designated marksman lay bleeding in the dust, Sarah would discover that sometimes destiny arrives not through years of preparation, but in a single moment when everything you thought you knew about yourself gets thrown out the window. What happened next would not only change the course of a dangerous mission, but would challenge everything the military thought they knew about who belongs behind a scope. This is the story of how a young woman from small-town Texas who had never fired a sniper rifle in combat made a shot that military historians would later call impossible, and how that single bullet would ripple through her life in ways she never expected. The spotter's measurement would confirm what everyone already suspected. This wasn't just luck. This was something else entirely. Sarah Martinez grew up in the dusty plains of West Texas, where the horizon stretched endlessly, and the nearest neighbor lived 3 miles down a dirt road. Her father, Miguel, ran a small cattle ranch that had been in the family for 3 generations, and her mother, Linda, taught 3rd grade at the local elementary school. Sarah was their only child, born after years of trying, and they treated her like the miracle she was to them. The ranch life shaped Sarah in ways she wouldn't understand until much later. Every morning before school, she helped her father check on the cattle, mend fences, and handle the 1,000 small tasks that kept a ranch running. Her hands grew strong from wrestling with stubborn wire fences, her eyes sharp from scanning vast pastures for strays, and her patience deep from waiting hours for the right moment to approach a spooked animal. Miguel taught her to shoot when she was 12, starting with an old .22 rifle that had belonged to his grandfather. They would set up tin cans on fence posts, and Sarah would practice until her shoulder ached from the rifle's kick. She was naturally gifted, able to hit targets that impressed even her father, who had served in the Army during the Gulf War. But for Sarah, shooting was just another ranch skill, like roping or horseback riding. She never thought of it as anything special. High school brought its own challenges. Sarah was smart, ranking in the top 10 of her graduating class, but college seemed like a distant dream. The ranch struggled financially, hit by drought and falling cattle prices, and her parents worked double shifts just to keep food on the table. Sarah watched her father age rapidly, his shoulders bowing under the weight of debt and responsibility. She knew she needed to find her own path. The military recruiter arrived during her senior year, a polished Marine sergeant with crisp uniforms and promises of education benefits and steady pay. Sarah listened to his pitch about serving her country and earning money for college, but what really caught her attention was the stability. The military offered something her small town couldn't: a guaranteed future. She enlisted as a communications specialist, drawn by the promise of working with advanced technology and the possibility of a career in the growing field of information technology. Her parents were proud, but worried. Miguel especially struggled with the idea of his daughter going to war, remembering his own deployment and the things he had seen. Basic training at Paris Island was everything she expected and worse. The drill instructors were relentless, the physical demands crushing, and the mental pressure constant. But Sarah had grown up working dawn to dusk on the ranch, and she had developed a quiet toughness that served her well. While other recruits broke down or washed out, Sarah endured. She wasn't the fastest runner or the strongest Marine, but she had something that couldn't be taught: an unshakable determination. Her marksmanship scores during basic training caught attention. Sarah consistently hit targets that other Marines struggled with, earning perfect scores on qualification days. Her instructors noted her natural ability, but Sarah was already committed to communications training. She wanted to work with radios and computers, not rifles. After basic training, Sarah went to communication school at 29 Palms, California. She excelled at learning radio protocols, satellite communications, and the complex systems that kept military units connected across vast distances. The technical work challenged her mind in ways that shooting never had, and she loved the precision required to maintain communication networks under difficult conditions. Her first deployment came 18 months later. Afghanistan in 2018 was winding down compared to the peak fighting years, but it was still a dangerous place where Marines died regularly. Sarah was assigned to Forward Operating Base Chapman, in Coast Province, a dusty collection of concrete barriers and prefab buildings surrounded by mountains that seemed to stretch forever. Chapman was home to about 300 Marines and soldiers, most of them focused on training Afghan forces and conducting patrols in the surrounding valleys. Sarah worked in the communications center, a windowless room filled with radios, computers, and the constant chatter of units checking in from across the region. It was important work, but it kept her removed from the fighting that happened beyond the base's walls. The Marines she worked with were a tight group, bonded by shared danger and the knowledge that they depended on each other completely. There was Corporal James Thompson, a sniper from rural Montana, whose steady hands and calm demeanor made him one of the most respected marksmen in the unit. Staff Sergeant Maria Rodriguez, a veteran of 3 deployments who ran the communications center with military precision. Private First Class David Kim, a young Marine from Los Angeles who maintained the base's computer networks and dreamed of starting his own tech company after his enlistment ended. She was competent at her job, reliable under pressure, and had a dry sense of humor that helped during the long, boring hours between missions. The other Marines respected her professionalism and gradually accepted her as part of the team. But she always felt slightly separate from the combat Marines, the ones who went outside the wire regularly and faced the enemy directly. The base itself was a study in contradictions. Inside the perimeter, there were modern facilities, reliable electricity, and decent food. Marines could video chat with family back home, work out in a well-equipped gym, and watch movies in their downtime. But beyond the concrete walls and razor wire lay a landscape where Taliban fighters moved freely, where improvised explosive devices killed Marines regularly, and where a moment's inattention could mean death. Sarah's daily routine was structured around the needs of the units she supported. She woke before dawn to check overnight communications, spent her days monitoring radio traffic and maintaining equipment, and often worked late into the night coordinating support for patrols that encountered problems. The work was vital but monotonous, and she sometimes wondered if she was making a real difference in the war. Her relationship with the sniper teams was professional but distant. They were an elite group within the unit, specially trained Marines who operated with a level of independence that other soldiers envied. Sarah handled their communications when they were on missions, relaying their reports and coordinating support, but she rarely interacted with them personally. Corporal Thompson was different from the other snipers. He was quieter, more thoughtful, and treated everyone with respect regardless of their job. During slow periods in the communications center, he would stop by to chat about home or share stories from his childhood in Montana. Sarah learned that he had grown up hunting with his grandfather, that he missed the mountains and forests of his home state, and that he planned to become a park ranger after leaving the Marines. Thompson also noticed Sarah's marksmanship scores from her personnel file and occasionally made comments about her natural ability. He suggested she consider cross-training as a designated marksman, but Sarah always deflected these conversations. She was happy with her current job and had no desire to carry a sniper rifle into combat. The first major incident of Sarah's deployment happened 3 months after her arrival. A patrol from their unit hit an improvised explosive device while returning from a village meeting, killing 1 Marine and wounding 3 others. Sarah was on duty in the communications center when the call came in, and she spent the next 6 hours coordinating medical evacuations and supporting the recovery mission. The dead Marine was Private Johnson, a 19-year-old from Ohio who had arrived at the base just 2 weeks earlier. Sarah had helped him set up his email account and shown him how to call his girlfriend back home. Now he was gone, killed by a bomb buried in a road he had traveled safely dozens of times before. The funeral was held on the base 2 days later, a somber ceremony where Marines who barely knew Johnson stood at attention while his personal effects were packed for shipment home. Sarah watched from the communications center, monitoring radio traffic, while her colleagues paid their respects. The contrast between the formal ceremony and the mundane work of war struck her forcefully. After Johnson's death, the atmosphere on the base changed. Patrols became more cautious, security was increased, and everyone seemed more aware of their mortality. Sarah found herself thinking more about the Marines who left the base each day, wondering if she would be coordinating their rescue or their funeral the next time she heard their voices on the radio. The sniper teams took Johnson's death particularly hard. He had been assigned as a spotter to one of their teams, and they blamed themselves for not protecting him. Thompson became more withdrawn, spending hours cleaning his rifle and studying maps of the surrounding terrain. The other snipers threw themselves into training, practicing their craft with an intensity that bordered on obsession. Sarah watched this transformation with growing unease. She had joined the military for stability and education benefits, but she was beginning to understand that war demanded more than just competent performance of duties. It required a willingness to risk everything for people you might barely know, and she wasn't sure she possessed that kind of courage. The mission that would change everything began with routine planning 2 weeks later. Intelligence indicated that a high-value Taliban leader was meeting with local commanders in a village about 15 miles from the base. The meeting represented a rare opportunity to capture or kill someone who had been responsible for numerous attacks on coalition forces. The plan called for a combined operation involving infantry, snipers, and air support. Sarah would remain at the base to coordinate communications, her usual role in such missions. But as the Marines prepared their equipment and reviewed their assignments, she felt an unusual sense of foreboding that she couldn't explain. Thompson stopped by the communications center the night before the mission, ostensibly to check radio frequencies, but clearly wanting to talk. He seemed nervous, unusual for someone with his experience and reputation. They discussed the mission parameters and backup communications procedures, but their conversation gradually turned to more personal topics. He talked about his grandfather, who had taught him to hunt in the mountains of Montana. The old man had been a sniper in Vietnam, though he rarely discussed his war experiences. Thompson had learned to shoot by following his grandfather through dense forests, learning patience and precision while tracking elk and deer. The skills had translated perfectly to military service, but Thompson sometimes wondered if he was meant for something different. Sarah found herself sharing stories about the ranch, about the long hours spent watching cattle, and the satisfaction of honest work. She talked about her parents' struggles and her own hopes for the future, dreams that seemed increasingly distant as her deployment wore on. For the first time since arriving in Afghanistan, she felt truly connected to another person. The conversation ended when Thompson was called to a final briefing, but he paused at the door of the communications center and looked back at Sarah. There was something in his expression that she couldn't read, a mixture of concern and determination that made her stomach tighten with worry. He started to say something, then changed his mind and simply nodded before disappearing into the corridor. Sarah spent the rest of the night checking equipment and reviewing procedures, but her mind kept returning to that look in Thompson's eyes. She had seen combat veterans before, Marines who carried the weight of their experiences in their posture and expressions. But Thompson had looked different, as if he was seeing something the rest of them couldn't. The morning of the mission dawned clear and hot, with temperatures that would reach over 100 degrees by midday. Sarah was in the communications center before sunrise, establishing contact with the various elements of the mission and confirming that all systems were operational. The infantry loaded into armored vehicles, the sniper teams checked their equipment one final time, and helicopter crews prepared for potential medical evacuations. Thompson's team consisted of himself as the primary shooter and Lance Corporal Martinez as his spotter. No relation to Sarah, despite sharing a surname. They would be positioned on a ridge overlooking the target village, providing overwatch for the infantry assault and engaging high-value targets as they appeared. As the convoy left the base, Sarah settled into her routine of monitoring radio traffic and maintaining communication links. The mission was expected to last most of the day, and she prepared for long hours of tension broken by brief moments of intense activity. She had no way of knowing that within a few hours, she would be holding a rifle she had never fired, facing a decision that would define the rest of her life. The last normal moment of Sarah's deployment came at 0847 hours, when Thompson's voice crackled over the radio with a routine position report. His team was in place on the ridge, had good visibility of the target area, and was standing by for the infantry assault. Sarah acknowledged the report and noted it in her log, just another entry in what she expected to be a long but routine day. At 0851 hours, everything changed. The first sign of trouble came as static across the radio frequency, followed by Lance Corporal Martinez's voice, tight with stress and barely controlled panic. "Base, this is Overwatch 2. We have contact. Thompson is down. I repeat, Thompson is down." Sarah's hands moved automatically to her controls, switching to the emergency frequency and alerting the medical team, but her mind struggled to process what she was hearing. Thompson, the unshakable sniper who had been talking with her just hours before, was wounded somewhere on a mountainside 15 miles away. Overwatch 2, this is base, Sarah transmitted, forcing her voice to remain calm and professional. What is the nature of Thompson's injuries? Do you require immediate medical evacuation? Martinez's response came through bursts of automatic weapon fire in the background. Base, Thompson took shrapnel from an RPG. He's conscious but bleeding badly from his left arm and shoulder. I've got pressure on the wounds, but I can't move him without exposing us both to enemy fire. The tactical situation was becoming clear through the confused radio chatter from multiple units. The Taliban had anticipated the coalition assault and prepared an ambush. Instead of finding their target in the village, the Marines had walked into a carefully planned trap. Enemy fighters were positioned in buildings throughout the area, and more were moving in from the surrounding hills. The infantry commander's voice cut through the chaos with sharp, urgent commands. All units, this is actual. We are taking effective fire from multiple positions. I need immediate suppression of targets to the north and east of the village. Overwatch teams, I need you to start putting rounds down range now. But Overwatch 2 was out of action. Martinez continued his reports, describing a tactical nightmare unfolding on the ridge. Thompson was severely wounded. Their position was under direct fire, and enemy fighters were attempting to flank them from two directions. Without the sniper team's support, the infantry below was pinned down and taking casualties. Sarah found herself at the center of a communication storm, coordinating between the trapped infantry, the wounded sniper team, helicopter crews preparing for medical evacuation, and command elements trying to understand the rapidly deteriorating situation. She had trained for this, but the reality of combat communications was more chaotic and demanding than any exercise. Base, this is Overwatch 2. Martinez called again, his voice showing signs of strain. I need immediate reinforcement up here. There are at least a dozen enemy fighters moving to surround our position. If they get any closer, we're going to be overrun. The quick reaction force was already mobilizing, but it would take them at least 20 minutes to reach the sniper team's position. In the meantime, Martinez was alone with a wounded partner, facing overwhelming odds while trying to provide support for the embattled infantry below. Sarah listened to the radio traffic with growing horror as the situation continued to deteriorate. The infantry was taking casualties from accurate sniper fire, unable to advance or retreat safely. 2 Marines were already confirmed wounded, and medical evacuation helicopters were having difficulty approaching the landing zone due to intense ground fire. Then came the transmission that changed everything. Base, this is Overwatch 2, Martinez called, his voice now showing clear desperation. Thompson is unconscious from blood loss. I'm trying to keep him stable, but I can't operate the rifle system and treat him at the same time. I need someone up here who can shoot. The quick reaction force leader immediately responded, but his news wasn't good. They were still 15 minutes away and facing their own problems with roadside bombs and small arms fire. The helicopter crews were equally stymied, unable to risk their aircraft in the intense ground fire around the ridge. Sarah stared at her communications console, processing the tactical situation with growing clarity. Thompson's sniper rifle was one of the most advanced systems in the military arsenal, capable of precise shots at ranges exceeding a mile. Without it in action, the Marines below had no way to suppress the enemy snipers who were methodically picking them off from concealed positions. The base commander entered the communications center, his face grim as he monitored the radio traffic. Colonel Williams was a veteran of multiple combat deployments, and Sarah could see him mentally calculating odds and options. None of them were good. "Sir?" Sarah said, surprised to hear her own voice cutting through the radio chatter. "I could get up there." Colonel Williams looked at her with surprise, and something that might have been admiration. "Martinez, you're a communications specialist. That's not your job." "Sir, I can shoot," Sarah replied, her voice steadier than she felt. "My marksmanship scores were high in basic training, and Thompson has been teaching me about the rifle system during downtime. I know the basic operation procedures." The colonel studied her for a long moment, clearly weighing impossible options. Sending an untrained Marine into a firefight violated every tactical principle, but the alternative was watching trained infantry Marines die while their support weapons remained silent. "The helicopter can get you close to the ridge," he said finally, "but you'd have to cover the last half-mile on foot, under fire, through terrain you've never seen before." Sarah nodded, already moving toward the equipment locker where her combat gear was stored. Her hands shook slightly as she pulled on her body armor and helmet, but her mind was surprisingly clear. She had made the decision, and now she needed to execute it. The helicopter crew was initially reluctant to take a communications specialist into a hot landing zone, but direct orders from the colonel overcome their objections. Sarah strapped herself into the aircraft, clutching her personal weapon and a bag of medical supplies, while the crew chief explained the insertion plan. They would approach the ridge from the east, using the mountain terrain to mask their approach from enemy positions. Sarah would fast rope down to a point about 800 meters from Thompson's position, then move on foot through a series of rocky outcroppings that should provide concealment from enemy observation. As the helicopter lifted off, Sarah felt a strange sense of calm settle over her. The decision was made, the plan was in motion, and all that remained was execution. She thought about Thompson, bleeding on a mountainside, and about the Marines pinned down in the valley below. For the first time since joining the military, she felt like she was exactly where she needed to be. The flight to the ridge took 12 minutes during which Sarah could hear the radio chatter from the ongoing firefight. Martinez was still trying to treat Thompson while providing updates on enemy movement, his voice growing more strained with each transmission. The infantry commander reported another Marine wounded, and medical evacuation was still impossible due to ground fire. The helicopter pilot's voice came through Sarah's headset as they approached the insertion point. "Martinez, we're taking some small arms fire from the valley. I'm going to have to drop you fast and get out of here. You'll be on your own until the quick reaction force can reach you." Sarah acknowledged the information and prepared for the fast rope descent. She had practiced this maneuver during training, but never under fire and never with such high stakes. The crew chief positioned her at the aircraft's open door, and she could see the rocky terrain of the ridge spreading out below. The rope descended, and Sarah followed it down, her equipment weighing her down and making the descent more difficult than she remembered from training. Bullets cracked past the helicopter, and she could hear the distinctive sound of enemy rifles firing from multiple positions. The aircraft departed immediately after she touched down, leaving her alone on an exposed mountainside, with the sound of combat echoing from all directions. Sarah's first priority was reaching Martinez and Thompson. She moved carefully through the rocky terrain, using the cover technique she had learned in infantry training but never expected to need. The weight of her equipment made movement difficult, and the thin mountain air left her breathing hard after just a few hundred meters. The sounds of combat grew louder as she approached the sniper position. She could hear Martinez talking to Thompson, trying to keep the wounded Marine conscious while maintaining watch for enemy movement. The tactical radio crackled with updates from the valley below, where the situation continued to deteriorate. Sarah finally reached the sniper position after what felt like hours, but had been only 20 minutes. Martinez looked up at her approach, his face showing relief and surprise in equal measure. Thompson was pale and unconscious, a field dressing covering wounds on his left shoulder and arm that had bled through the bandages. "Thank God you're here," Martinez said, never taking his eyes completely off the terrain below. "Thompson lost a lot of blood before I could get the bleeding stopped. He's stable for now, but he needs medical evacuation soon." Sarah knelt beside Thompson, checking his pulse and breathing while Martinez briefed her on the tactical situation. Enemy snipers were positioned in at least 3 locations around the valley, systematically engaging any Marine who exposed himself. The infantry was effectively pinned down, unable to advance or retreat without taking casualties. Thompson's rifle system lay beside his position, a precision instrument that Sarah had only seen from a distance before today. Martinez quickly explained the basic operation, showing her how to adjust the scope, chamber a round, and operate the safety mechanisms. The weapon was more complex than anything she had trained with, but the fundamental principles were the same as the hunting rifles she had grown up using. "The primary target is about 900 meters out," Martinez explained, pointing to a building on the far side of the valley. "There's a sniper in there who's been picking off our guys systematically. Thompson got one shot off before the RPG hit us, but he missed. The guy is still active." Sarah positioned herself behind the rifle, settling into a shooting position that felt both foreign and familiar. The scope provided incredible detail of the target building, and she could see muzzle flashes from the enemy sniper's position. The distance was longer than anything she had ever attempted, but the principles her father had taught her with tin cans on fence posts still applied. The first shot was a miss, the bullet impacting the building several feet to the right of the target. Sarah worked the bolt action smoothly, chambering another round while Martinez provided corrections to her aim. The second shot was closer, and she could see debris fly from the wall near the sniper's position. On her third attempt, Sarah found the rhythm that had served her well during childhood target practice. She controlled her breathing, squeezed the trigger smoothly, and felt the rifle recoil against her shoulder. Through the scope, she saw the enemy sniper's position go silent, the muzzle flashes stopping abruptly. "Target down," Martinez confirmed, watching through his spotting scope. "That was a clean hit at 912 meters. Thompson is going to be pissed that he missed and you didn't." Enemy fighters were still active in 2 other positions, and the infantry below remained pinned down. Sarah worked methodically through the remaining targets, using the skills her father had taught her and the patience she had learned during long hours watching cattle on the ranch. Each shot required careful calculation of distance, wind conditions, and target movement. Martinez provided spotting assistance, calling out corrections and confirming hits, while Sarah focused on the mechanical precision of marksmanship. The chaos of combat seemed to fade away, replaced by the familiar calm she had always felt when shooting. By the time the quick reaction force arrived an hour later, Sarah had eliminated 4 enemy snipers and suppressed fire from 2 machine gun positions. The infantry was able to advance, secure the village, and establish a landing zone for medical evacuation. Thompson was airlifted to a field hospital, conscious and asking about the mission results. The spotter's measurements would later confirm what everyone had witnessed. Sarah Martinez, a communications specialist who had never fired a sniper rifle in combat, had made multiple confirmed kills at ranges exceeding 900 meters. In military terms, she had performed at the level of an elite marksman while under intense enemy fire. But as Sarah sat beside Thompson's abandoned rifle, waiting for the helicopter that would take them back to base, she felt no sense of triumph or accomplishment. She had killed people today, enemy fighters who had been trying to kill her fellow Marines. But the reality of taking human lives was more complex than she had expected. The ride back to base passed in relative silence, with Sarah lost in thought while Martinez provided a detailed account of the engagement to the helicopter crew. She stared out at the Afghan landscape, the same mountains and valleys that had seemed so foreign when she arrived, and wondered how this day would change everything that came after. Thompson survived his wounds and would eventually return to duty, though not as a sniper. The Marines who had been pinned down in the valley all made it home alive, several of them crediting Sarah's shooting with saving their lives. The mission was considered a tactical success, despite not capturing the high-value target they had originally sought. But Sarah knew that the real measuring had nothing to do with distance or accuracy. The spotter's calculations would become part of her military record, documenting her transition from a communication specialist to something entirely different. What they couldn't measure was the cost of that transformation, or the weight she would carry from the day she wasn't meant to take the shot, but did anyway. The weeks following the mission brought changes that Sarah hadn't anticipated. Word of her actions spread quickly through the base and beyond, carried by the informal network of stories and rumors that connected military units across Afghanistan. She found herself the subject of curious stares and hushed conversations, a communications specialist who had somehow become a legendary marksman in the span of a single afternoon. Colonel Williams called her to his office 3 days after the mission, a formal meeting that Sarah approached with considerable anxiety. She expected recognition, possibly discipline for exceeding her assigned duties, or both. What she found instead was a conversation that would reshape her understanding of her own capabilities and future. "Martinez," the colonel began, studying her personnel files spread across his desk. "I've received some interesting phone calls about you. Seems your performance on that ridge has attracted attention from people much higher up the chain of command than me." Sarah maintained her composure, though she felt a familiar nervousness that reminded her of being called to the principal's office in high school. "Sir, I was just doing what needed to be done to support the mission." Colonel Williams smiled, the first genuine expression of warmth she had seen from him since arriving at the base. That's exactly what those phone calls were about. You demonstrated initiative, courage, and skill under conditions that would challenge experienced combat veterans. The question now is what we do with those talents. The options presented to Sarah were both exciting and terrifying. She could remain in her current position as a communications specialist, with the unofficial understanding that she might be called upon for similar missions in the future. Alternatively, she could volunteer for specialized training as a designated marksman, a role that would combine her technical skills with her newly demonstrated shooting abilities. There was a third option, one that Colonel Williams presented with obvious reluctance. Military schools were always looking for exceptional candidates, and Sarah's combination of technical expertise and combat performance made her an ideal candidate for advanced training programs. She could potentially attend sniper school, reconnaissance training, or even officer candidate school, if she was interested in making the military a career. Sarah asked for time to consider her options, but she already knew what her answer would be. The girl who had enlisted for stability and education benefits no longer existed. In her place was someone who had discovered capabilities she never knew she possessed, someone who had saved lives through precise application of lethal force. Thompson returned to duty 2 weeks later, his left arm still weak from his wounds but his spirit intact. He sought out Sarah immediately, finding her in the communications center during a quiet afternoon shift. The conversation that followed was awkward at first. Two people trying to process an experience that had changed both of their lives. "I heard what you did up there," Thompson said, settling into a chair beside her workstation. "Martinez told me about the shots you made. 900 meters, first time with that rifle system, under fire. That's not normal, Sarah. That's something special." Sarah found herself uncomfortable with the praise, uncertain how to respond to recognition for actions that had felt both natural and completely foreign. "I just did what you would have done if you had been able to shoot." Thompson shook his head, wincing slightly as the movement pulled at his healing wounds. "No, that's not true. What you did required more than training or experience. It required the ability to stay calm under pressure, to make precise calculations while people were shooting at you, and to take human lives without hesitation when the mission required it. Those aren't skills you can teach. They're something you either have or you don't." Their conversation continued for hours, ranging over topics that Sarah had never discussed with anyone. Thompson talked about the psychological impact of being a sniper, the weight of taking lives at long range, and the strange disconnect between the clinical precision of marksmanship and the human cost of each shot. Sarah found herself sharing thoughts and feelings she hadn't even admitted to herself. The isolation of being a sniper was something Thompson understood better than most. Unlike infantry Marines who fought as part of a unit, snipers operated in pairs or even alone, making life-and-death decisions without immediate supervision or support. The responsibility was enormous, and not everyone could handle it psychologically. "The hardest part," Thompson explained, "isn't the shooting itself. It's everything that comes after. You'll replay every shot in your mind, wondering if you made the right decision, if there was another way to accomplish the mission. The enemy fighters you killed had families, had reasons for being there that made sense to them. You'll think about that too." Sarah had already begun experiencing some of what Thompson described. Her sleep was disturbed by dreams of looking through the rifle scope, seeing faces in the crosshairs that became increasingly detailed and human with each repetition. She found herself distracted during routine duties, her mind returning to those moments on the ridge when she had held the power of life and death in her hands. But there was another side to her experience that she struggled to articulate. Along with the psychological weight of taking lives came a sense of purpose and capability that she had never experienced before. For the first time in her military service, she felt like she was making a direct, measurable difference in the outcome of combat operations. The decision to volunteer for sniper training came gradually, through conversations with Thompson, long nights of reflection, and the growing realization that her talents could save more lives if properly developed and applied. She submitted her application through Colonel Williams, who endorsed it enthusiastically and promised to support her through the challenging selection process. Sniper school was everything Sarah expected, and worse. The physical demands were crushing, the academic requirements extensive, and the psychological pressure constant. She was one of only 3 women in a class of 24 candidates, and she faced skepticism from instructors and fellow students who doubted whether her combat performance had been skill or luck. The training was designed to break down civilian thinking patterns and rebuild them according to military precision. Students learned advanced mathematics for calculating bullet trajectory, meteorology for understanding wind patterns, fieldcraft for remaining undetected in hostile territory, and psychology for maintaining emotional stability while taking human lives. Sarah's background gave her advantages that some of her classmates lacked. Her ranch upbringing had taught her patience and observation skills that proved valuable during stalking exercises. Her communications training helped her master the complex radio procedures required for coordinating sniper operations. Most importantly, her combat experience provided a psychological foundation that purely theoretical training couldn't match. The academic portion of sniper school was more challenging than Sarah had anticipated. Students were required to master ballistics calculations that could determine the precise trajectory of a bullet over distances exceeding a mile, accounting for factors including altitude, temperature, humidity, wind speed, and direction, and the Earth's rotation. A mistake of a few degrees or a few feet per second could mean the difference between a successful shot and a complete miss. Physical training was equally demanding. Sniper teams often operated alone for days or weeks, carrying heavy equipment across difficult terrain while remaining undetected by enemy forces. Students practiced moving silently through various environments, constructing concealed observation positions, and maintaining physical readiness during extended periods of immobility. The psychological training was perhaps the most important and the most difficult. Students were taught to compartmentalize their emotions, to make rapid decisions under pressure, and to live with the consequences of their actions. Mock scenarios placed them in situations where they had to choose between mission success and civilian casualties, between following orders and following their conscience. Sarah's first major challenge came during the stalking phase of training, an exercise where students had to approach within shooting range of instructors without being detected. The course covered several square miles of varied terrain, and instructors used binoculars and other optical equipment to scan for any sign of student movement. Sarah drew on her ranch experience, remembering hours spent approaching skittish cattle that would bolt at the slightest sound or sudden movement. She moved slowly and deliberately, using natural terrain features for concealment and timing her movement to coincide with wind or other natural sounds that would mask any noise she made. The exercise took 14 hours, during which Sarah covered less than 2 miles while remaining completely undetected. She reached her assigned position as the sun was setting, exhausted but successful. Several of her classmates were discovered and failed the exercise, requiring them to repeat the training or face dismissal from the program. Marksmanship training presented different challenges. Sarah's natural ability was evident, but sniper-level precision required consistency and accuracy far beyond anything she had previously attempted. She spent hours on shooting ranges, firing hundreds of rounds under varying conditions while instructors critiqued every aspect of her technique. The pressure was constant and deliberate. Instructors would introduce distractions during shooting exercises, simulating the stress and chaos of combat conditions. Sarah learned to maintain her concentration while artillery simulators exploded nearby, while instructors shouted contradictory commands, and while she was forced to remain in uncomfortable shooting positions for extended periods. Her most difficult moment came during a night shooting exercise, when she was required to engage multiple targets at varying distances using night vision equipment. The targets were designed to simulate enemy snipers who had been picking off coalition forces, and successful completion of the exercise required precision shooting under conditions that pushed her abilities to their limits. Sarah's first few shots missed their targets completely, the unfamiliar night vision equipment throwing off her depth perception and target acquisition. She forced herself to remain calm, to apply the breathing and trigger control techniques she had mastered during daylight training, and to trust the skills she had developed over months of intensive practice. Her breakthrough came when she stopped trying to force success and instead allowed her natural abilities to take over. The night vision equipment became just another tool, the distance calculations became routine, and the shots began finding their targets with increasing consistency. By the end of the exercise, She was hitting targets at ranges that impressed even the veteran instructors. Graduation from sniper school came after 6 months of the most challenging training Sarah had ever experienced. Of the 24 students who began the program, only 14 successfully completed all requirements and earned the designation of qualified military sniper. Sarah finished third in her class, with scores that placed her among the top 5% of graduates in the program's history. The ceremony was attended by Colonel Williams, who had flown in specifically to recognize Sarah's achievement. Thompson was also present, his wounds healed and his confidence in Sarah's abilities completely validated by her training performance. Her parents watched via video link from Texas, their pride evident despite their continuing concerns about their daughter's chosen profession. Sarah's first assignment as a qualified sniper took her back to Afghanistan, but to a different base and a different mission. She was assigned to a reconnaissance team operating in the mountainous region along the Pakistan border, an area where Taliban and al-Qaeda fighters moved freely and coalition forces maintained only a tenuous presence. The work was exactly what her training had prepared her for. Long periods of observation and patience, punctuated by moments of intense action and life-or-death decision-making. Sarah and her spotter, Staff Sergeant Michael Chen, operated as an independent team, spending weeks at a time in remote observation positions while gathering intelligence on enemy movement and activities. Their first major mission involved tracking a group of foreign fighters who intelligence indicated were planning attacks on coalition bases. Sarah and Chen established an observation position on a ridge overlooking a valley known to be used as a transit route, and settled in for what they expected to be a week-long surveillance mission. The waiting was the hardest part. Sarah had learned patience during her ranch childhood, but sniper operations required a level of motionless observation that challenged even her well-developed tolerance for tedium. Hours passed without any sign of target activity, while she and Chen maintained constant vigilance through their optical equipment. On the fourth day, their targets appeared, a group of 12 fighters moving through the valley in small groups, carrying weapons and equipment that clearly identified them as combatants rather than local civilians. Sarah tracked them through her rifle scope, while Chen gathered intelligence through his spotting scope and coordinated with command elements via encrypted radio. The engagement parameters were clear. The fighters were carrying weapons in a designated combat zone, they matched the description of targets that intelligence had been tracking for weeks, and they were moving toward areas where coalition forces operated regularly. Sarah was authorized to engage at her discretion, based on her assessment of the tactical situation. The shot she took was at a distance of 1,247 meters, engaging the apparent leader of the group as he paused to study a map. Sarah had calculated wind speed and direction, accounted for the elevation difference between her position and the target, and adjusted for the temperature and humidity conditions that would affect bullet trajectory. The bullet took nearly 2 seconds to reach its target, during which Sarah maintained her sight picture while Chen tracked the shot through his spotting scope. The impact was immediately visible, and the remaining fighters scattered into cover, apparently unaware of where the shot had originated. Over the next 30 minutes, Sarah engaged 3 more targets as they attempted to move through the valley, each shot requiring new calculations and adjustments for changing conditions. Chen provided spotting assistance and maintained communication with supporting units, while Sarah focused on the mechanical precision of long-range marksmanship. The mission was considered a complete success. Intelligence later confirmed that the fighters Sarah had engaged were indeed foreign combatants, responsible for multiple attacks on coalition forces. Her shooting had disrupted their planned operations and eliminated several high-value targets that had evaded capture for months. But the psychological impact of the mission was more complex than its tactical success. Sarah found herself thinking about the fighters she had killed, wondering about their backgrounds and motivations. Unlike her first combat experience on the ridge, where she had acted instinctively to save fellow Marines, this mission had been more deliberate and planned. Thompson's warnings about the psychological isolation of sniper work proved accurate. Sarah began to understand the unique burden of taking lives at long range, where targets became individuals visible through high-powered optics rather than anonymous figures in the chaos of close combat. The precision required for successful sniping meant that every shot was deliberate and calculated, making it impossible to claim that killing was accidental or unintentional. Her deployment continued for another 8 months, during which she completed 17 more missions and achieved a total of 23 confirmed kills. Her reputation grew within special operations circles, and she received recognition including a Bronze Star and a Purple Heart after being wounded by mortar fragments during one mission. But Sarah's most significant achievement wasn't measured in enemy casualties or military decorations. She had proven that exceptional marksmanship ability could emerge from unexpected backgrounds, and her success opened opportunities for other women in combat roles that had previously been considered exclusively male domains. The final measurement of Sarah's transformation came when she returned to Texas on leave, visiting the ranch where she had learned to shoot tin cans off fence posts. Her father met her at the airport, his pride evident but tempered by concern for the changes he could see in his daughter's eyes and posture. They spent an afternoon together on the ranch, walking the same trails where Sarah had learned to track cattle and develop the patience that would serve her so well as a sniper. Miguel had prepared a shooting range behind the barn, using the same fence posts and tin cans that had been Sarah's first targets years earlier. "Show me what you've learned," he said, handing her the same .22 rifle she had used as a child. Sarah settled into a shooting position that felt both familiar and completely different from her childhood memories. The rifle was lighter than the precision weapons she now carried. The targets were closer than any she had engaged in combat, and the stakes were infinitely lower. But the fundamental skills were the same: breath control, sight alignment, trigger squeeze, and follow-through. Her first shot missed the tin can completely, the bullet passing high and to the right. Sarah worked the bolt action and fired again, this time hitting the fence post but missing the can. It wasn't until her fourth shot that she managed to hit the target, the tin can spinning off the post with a satisfying metallic ring. Miguel watched silently as his daughter struggled with targets that she had once hit consistently. He understood what Sarah was only beginning to realize, that coming home from war required its own form of adjustment and relearning. The skills that had kept her alive in Afghanistan were not necessarily the same skills she would need for the civilian life she would eventually return to. They spent the rest of the afternoon shooting and talking, Sarah gradually rediscovering the simple pleasure of marksmanship without tactical objectives or life-and-death consequences. Miguel shared stories about his own return from the Gulf War, the challenges of readjusting to civilian life, and the importance of maintaining connections to the person she had been before the military changed her. As the sun set over the Texas plains, Sarah reflected on the distance she had traveled from that first day when she enlisted for stability and education benefits. The measurements that mattered now went far beyond the 2,247 meters of her longest confirmed kill, or the distances she had covered in combat operations. She had measured her own capacity for courage under pressure, her ability to make life-and-death decisions, and her willingness to sacrifice personal safety for the welfare of others. She had discovered talents she never knew she possessed, and developed skills that would serve her for the rest of her life. The spotter's measurements from that first day on the ridge had documented her transition from communication specialist to combat sniper. But they couldn't capture the full scope of her transformation. Sarah Martinez had become someone she never expected to be, shaped by circumstances she couldn't have imagined when she left the ranch for basic training. Standing on the same ground where she had learned to shoot as a child, Sarah understood that her story was far from over. The military would provide more opportunities for service and growth, but ultimately she would need to decide what kind of person she wanted to become beyond her role as a sniper. The girl who wasn't meant to take the shot had become a woman who could make impossible shots under the most difficult conditions. But perhaps more importantly, she had learned that sometimes the most significant measurements in life aren't about distance or accuracy, but about the courage to step forward when others step back, and the willingness to accept responsibility for capabilities you never knew you had. Her father's voice interrupted her thoughts as he began collecting the tin cans and preparing to head back to the house. "You know," Miguel said, looking at his daughter with a mixture of pride and concern, "your grandfather would have been proud of what you've accomplished, but he would have reminded you that the most important shot is always the one you choose not to take." Sarah nodded, understanding the wisdom in her father's words. She had learned to be a precision killer, but she had also learned when killing was necessary and when other solutions might be possible. The measurements that would define the rest of her life would be about the balance between those two aspects of her training and character. As they walked back toward the ranch house, Sarah felt the weight of her experiences settling into a new perspective. She was still the same person who had grown up on this land, but she was also someone completely different. The challenge now was integrating those two identities into a coherent understanding of who she was meant to become. The spotter's final measurement would show that Sarah Martinez had traveled much further than the distance between a communications center and a sniper's nest. She had journeyed from uncertainty to confidence, from following orders to making critical decisions, and from seeking stability to accepting the responsibilities that came with exceptional abilities. The shot she wasn't meant to take had changed everything. Not just for the Marine she had saved that day, but for Sarah herself. And while the distances measured in meters and confirmed kills would become part of military records, the real measure of her transformation would be how she chose to use those hard-won skills and insights in whatever challenges lay ahead.